The night air was thick with salt, the distant crash of waves barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. I had just stepped onto the patio of Lisa's beach house when I felt a firm yet gentle hand close around my wrist. My breath caught as I turned. Richard, her father, stood there, his piercing eyes locked onto mine. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, serious. A shiver ran down my spine, not from the cool ocean breeze, but from something deeper, something dangerous. I had known Richard for years, had spent summers at their house since I was a teenager. He had always been charming, warm, but this was different. His fingers lingered on my wrist for just a second too long before he released me, stepping back as if to collect himself. Then he said something I will never forget. Words that would shift everything, blur every line, and set into motion something neither of us could ever take back. I didn't know it then, but that night, my best friend's father would change my life forever. What happens when a forbidden attraction spirals out of control? Stay with me. This is a story you won't want to miss. Subscribe now and let me know where you're watching from. I had always envied Lisa's life. It wasn't just the material things, the sprawling beach house, the designer clothes, or the luxury vacations. It was the effortless way she moved through the world, completely unaware of the privilege she carried. She was the kind of girl who never second-guessed herself, never hesitated, and never seemed to doubt that she was loved. And then there was her father, Richard. Unlike Lisa, he carried an air of quiet authority, the kind that made people sit up straighter when he entered a room, the kind that made you feel like he saw through you with just one glance. I had spent years around him, summers at their estate, sleepovers in Lisa's massive bedroom, family dinners where I was always treated like a second daughter. But it wasn't until this trip, this weekend at the beach house, that I realized there had always been something beneath the surface, something I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge. Lisa had invited me on a whim. She was impulsive like that, the kind of friend who made last-minute plans and expected everyone to follow along without question. "It'll be fun," she'd said, flashing that signature grin. "Just the two of us. Well, my dad will be there for a bit, but he's leaving for a business trip on Sunday. We'll have the place to ourselves after that." I hadn't thought much of it at the time. It was just another weekend, another escape from the monotony of my own life. But from the moment we arrived, I felt the shift, the unspoken tension that hummed in the air like a live wire. The house was breathtaking, perched on the edge of the coastline, its floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the endless expanse of the ocean. The salty breeze curled through the open doors, carrying the sound of waves crashing against the shore, a lullaby that made the entire place feel like a dream. Richard was already there when we arrived, his presence commanding even in the casual ease of his linen shirt and rolled-up sleeves. He greeted us warmly, his arms pulling Lisa into a hug before his eyes found mine. "Good to see you again," he said, his voice smooth, deep, the kind that made you lean in without realizing it. There was nothing inappropriate about the way he looked at me, nothing overtly suggestive, but still my stomach tightened in a way I couldn't quite explain. We settled into the house quickly, Lisa immediately diving into plans, beach days, cocktails on the patio, late-night movies. But from the very first night, I was aware of Richard in a way I hadn't been before. It was the way he moved, the way his presence filled the space. He wasn't like the boys Lisa and I gossiped about, wasn't like the men I had dated. He was assured, confident, powerful in a way that felt intoxicating. That first evening, after a long day in the sun, Lisa had gone to bed early, exhaustion pulling her under. I had stayed behind on the patio, wrapped in a light throw, staring out at the water, lost in my own thoughts when Richard stepped outside. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, cutting through the quiet. I turned to find him leaning against the doorway, a glass of bourbon in his hand. I shrugged, offering a small smile. Too much sun, I think. He walked closer, settling into the chair beside me, and for a while we just sat there in silence, the only sound the distant crash of waves and the occasional clink of ice in his glass. "You've grown up a lot," he said after a while, and when I turned to look at him there was something unreadable in his expression. "I still remember when you and Lisa were just kids, running around this place, sneaking into the wine cabinet, thinking I didn't notice." I laughed, the memory washing over me like a wave of nostalgia. "You knew about that?" His lips curved into a smirk, and for the first time I noticed the way his eyes lingered, the way his gaze dipped just for a second before meeting mine again. "I knew everything." The air between us shifted then, something subtle but undeniable. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was nothing more than the warmth of the night, the intimacy of the moment, but still my pulse quickened. It was harmless, I reasoned, just a conversation, but even as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The next day, Lisa and I spent most of our time on the beach, letting the sun kiss our skin, our laughter carried away by the wind. But beneath the surface, I felt restless, my thoughts drifting back to the night before, to the way Richard had looked at me. By the time evening rolled around, Lisa was exhausted again, passing out before the sun had even fully set. I wandered downstairs, drawn by the golden glow of the living room, where I found Richard sitting alone, another glass of bourbon in hand. "You don't sleep much, do you?" he mused as I stepped inside. "Neither do you," I countered, taking a seat on the opposite end of the couch. He studied me for a moment before leaning back, his posture relaxed, but his eyes told another story. "Lisa's lucky to have you," he said suddenly, catching me off guard. "She takes a lot for granted, but she's always had you." There was something weighted in his words, something deeper than casual conversation. I swallowed, unsure of what to say, my throat suddenly dry. "She's my best friend," I said simply, and he nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. Silence stretched between us, heavy, charged. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I should have stood up then, should have excused myself, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed, my heart pounding, my mind racing. And then, in the smallest, most imperceptible of movements, he reached out, his fingers barely brushing against mine where they rested on the couch. It was nothing, just a touch, a whisper of contact, but it sent a jolt through me, electric and undeniable. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and in that moment I knew this wasn't just in my head. It wasn't just the product of a wandering mind or an overactive imagination. This was real, and it was dangerous. I told myself I wouldn't let it happen again. I told myself that moment on the couch, that near invisible touch, was nothing more than an accident, a trick of the mind, a fleeting second that meant nothing. But as the days passed, as the summer heat thickened and the nights grew longer, I realized I was lying to myself. It wasn't just an accident, and it wasn't just a trick. I had felt it, the way Richard's touch had lingered, the way my body had reacted, the way my breath had hitched in my throat when his fingers brushed against mine. Lisa remained blissfully unaware of the shift, still lost in her own carefree world, her laughter ringing through the house like wind chimes on a breezy afternoon. But I noticed everything. I noticed the way Richard's eyes found mine across the room, the way his presence seemed to take up more space than it should, the way he carried himself with a quiet kind of dominance that made my pulse race in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. And then there were the stolen moments, the brief encounters that should have meant nothing but meant everything, a glance that lasted too long, a touch that wasn't quite accidental, a silence that spoke louder than any words ever could. One evening, after Lisa had gone to bed early again, I found myself wandering downstairs, my steps light against the hardwood floor, my pulse unsteady for reasons I refused to name. I told myself I was just restless, that I needed some air. But when I stepped onto the patio and saw him standing there, staring out at the ocean, I knew better. He turned at the sound of my footsteps, his eyes dark beneath the glow of the porch lights. "Can't sleep?" His voice was smooth, even, but there was something else beneath it, something unreadable. I hesitated before answering, my fingers curling against the hem of my oversized sweater. "I guess not," I admitted, stepping closer, my skin prickling from something that had nothing to do with the breeze. He took a sip from his glass, watching me over the rim before setting it down on the railing. "You and Lisa had a good day?" The question was casual, but his tone wasn't. I nodded, but I barely remembered what we had done. The only thing I could remember was this: the way he was looking at me, the way the air between us felt impossibly thick, like we were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't take back. I should have left. I should have turned around and gone back upstairs, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed, letting the silence stretch between us, letting the weight of it press against my chest. And then, in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. It was such a small touch, so light I could have ignored it, could have pretended I hadn't felt it, but I had. I had felt it all the way down to my bones. I swallowed hard, my breath unsteady as I looked up at him, my heart slamming against my ribs. "This is dangerous," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the distant crash of the waves. He didn't move away. He didn't drop my hand. Instead, he stepped closer, his body just inches from mine. "I know." His voice was low, rough, like he was fighting something he knew he shouldn't want, like he was fighting me. I should have pulled away. I should have broken the moment before it became something I couldn't undo. But instead, I stood there, letting his warmth seep into my skin, letting my pulse hammer against my throat, letting the inevitable crash down around me like a storm I had seen coming but had done nothing to avoid. The first kiss was nothing more than a whisper of contact, a barely there press of lips that sent a shockwave through my entire body. I gasped at the feeling, at the way it made my knees weak, at the way every nerve in my body seemed to light up all at once. And then he kissed me again, deeper this time, his hands finding my waist, pulling me against him in a way that made it impossible to pretend this was anything less than what it was. I should have pushed him away. I should have thought about Lisa, about the consequences, about all the ways this could end in disaster. But in that moment, with the ocean roaring behind us and his lips on mine, I didn't think about anything except how badly I wanted more. His hands roamed my body with a slow, deliberate confidence, tracing patterns against my skin, mapping out every inch of me like he was memorizing the way I felt beneath his touch. My fingers tangled in his shirt, gripping the fabric as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded. Every inch of space between us disappeared, replaced by heat, by need, by something dark and all. I had never felt anything like it before. The way he held me, the way he touched me, the way his breath mingled with mine in the quiet darkness of the night. It was reckless and dangerous and entirely, utterly intoxicating. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice screamed at me to stop, to walk away before it was too late, but the truth was, it was already too late. The second our lips met, the second his hands found my skin, the second I let myself fall into him, I had already crossed the line, and there was no going back. The sound of a door creaking open sent a jolt of fear through me, and I tore myself away from him, my breathing ragged, my pulse erratic. Richard stepped back just as quickly, running a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched tight. Lisa's voice called out from inside the house, sleepy and confused. "Are you out there?" My heart hammered as I scrambled for control, wiping at my lips, trying to steady my breath. "Yeah." I called back, forcing my voice to sound normal, even as my entire body trembled from the weight of what I had just done. Just getting some air. The moment shattered, the reality of what we had done settling like a heavy weight in the pit of my stomach. Richard met my gaze, his expression unreadable, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. For a second, I thought he might say something, that he might try to make sense of what had just happened. But then Lisa's footsteps padded closer, and in an instant, the moment was gone, swallowed by the darkness, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and guilt. Lisa stepped onto the patio, her hair messy from sleep, her eyes still heavy-lidded. "You okay?" she asked, rubbing at her face, completely unaware of the tension that still hung in the air. I forced a smile, nodding quickly, even though my entire body still hummed with the remnants of Richard's touch. "Yeah," I lied. "Just couldn't sleep." She yawned, stretching her arms over her head before glancing at her father. "You should get some rest too, Dad." Richard nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "I will," he said, his voice steady, betraying nothing of what had just happened between us. Lisa turned back to me, her lips pulling into a sleepy smile. "Come on," she said, looping her arm through mine. "Let's go back to bed." I let her pull me inside, my heart still racing, my hands still shaking. But as I climbed the stairs, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, one thought echoed through my mind, relentless and unshakable. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And no matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I told myself it could never happen again, I knew the truth. This wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness pressing down on my chest, the weight of last night curling around me like a vice. My body still burned where Richard had touched me. My lips still tingled from the memory of his kiss, and yet the guilt was just as strong as the desire that still pulsed through my veins. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic crash of the waves outside, but it didn't soothe me. Nothing could, because now everything had changed and I didn't know how to go back to the way things were before. Lisa was still asleep when I crept out of the room, my heart pounding as I made my way downstairs. I told myself I was just getting water, just clearing my head, but the second I stepped into the kitchen and saw Richard standing there, barefoot, his shirt slightly unbuttoned, coffee mug in hand, I knew the truth. I had come looking for him. His eyes met mine the second I entered, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick, charged, as if the very walls of the house were holding their breath. I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping the edge of the counter as if it could steady me. "About last night," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. Richard set his mug down slowly, exhaling a breath that was too heavy, too filled with things neither of us were ready to say. "I know," he said simply, but his voice was strained, his gaze flickering toward the stairs, as if expecting Lisa to appear at any moment. "We shouldn't have..." But I never got to finish that sentence, because in the next second he was in front of me, his hands framing my face, his lips crashing against mine. It was reckless, impulsive, but the moment our mouths met again, I lost every ounce of restraint I had left, my fingers tangled in his shirt, pulling him closer, drinking in the taste of him like I had been starving for it. The kiss was urgent, desperate, filled with the unspoken truth that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. We weren't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. His hand slid down my back, gripping my waist, pressing me against the counter as if he couldn't get enough. And neither could I. The sound of footsteps on the stairs sent a shockwave through me, and we tore apart just as Lisa's voice called out, still thick with sleep. "Dad, you up?" I barely had a second to compose myself before she appeared in the doorway, rubbing at her eyes, oblivious to the storm that had just raged between us. Richard turned away first, his movements calm, controlled, as if nothing had happened. As if his lips hadn't just been on mine, as if his hands hadn't just left burning trails across my skin. I forced myself to do the same, swallowing down the dizzying mixture of panic and longing that still clung to me. Lisa yawned, stretching as she made her way to the fridge. "You guys are up early," she mumbled, grabbing a bottle of water before turning to face us. Her eyes flicked between me and her father, a small frown tugging at her lips. "Everything okay?" My stomach clenched, my pulse thundering in my ears, but before I could speak, Richard stepped in effortlessly, his voice smooth, unreadable. "Just couldn't sleep," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "We were just talking." Lisa nodded, clearly too tired to question it further, but the way Richard looked at me when she wasn't paying attention sent shivers down my spine. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The rest of the day was a blur, filled with stolen glances, fleeting touches that sent sparks through my veins, and a tension so thick I could barely breathe. Every time Lisa left the room, every time we were alone for even a second, I could feel him, his presence, his heat, the invisible pull between us that refused to break. By the time evening rolled around, I was wound so tight I thought I might snap. Lisa wanted to go into town for drinks, to meet up with some old friends, and for once, I was grateful, because the second she left, Richard and I were no longer pretending, no longer holding back. The second the door closed behind her, he was on me, his hands gripping my waist, his lips crashing into mine with a force that stole my breath. I gasped against his mouth, my fingers fisting in his hair, pulling him closer, needing him closer. "I tried to stay away," he murmured against my lips, his breath ragged, his hands slipping beneath the hem of my shirt, his fingers burning against my skin. "I really did." But I didn't want him to stay away. I didn't want him to stop. I had spent all day craving this, craving him, and now that I had him, I wasn't letting go. We stumbled back into the living room, the dim glow of the sunset casting long shadows across the floor. His lips traced a path down my neck, his hands gripping my hips, his breath warm against my skin. I was drowning in him, lost in the way he made me feel, in the way he touched me, like I was something he had no right to want but couldn't resist. The sound of Lisa's car pulling into the driveway shattered everything. Panic shot through me like ice water, and I shoved him away, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. He stepped back just as quickly, raking a hand through his hair, his expression torn between frustration and regret. "Go," he whispered, his voice rough, desperate. "Before she sees you like this." My hands trembled as I straightened my shirt, my heart slamming against my ribs. And then, without another word, I turned and ran. I barely made it upstairs before the front door swung open, Lisa's laughter echoing through the house. My pulse was still racing, my skin still tingling from his touch, and yet, as I sat there in the dark, my back pressed against the door, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a mistake. This was an addiction, and I had no idea how to stop. The days that followed were a slow, suffocating descent into madness. I told myself it had to stop, that we had been reckless, that we were playing with fire in a way that would leave nothing but destruction in its wake. But the problem with addiction is that it doesn't care about reason. It doesn't care about the warnings flashing like sirens in your mind, the logical part of you screaming to walk away. Addiction only cares about the next hit, the next taste, the next moment where everything else falls away and all that remains is the high. And Richard had become my high. I avoided him the best I could, but it didn't matter. His presence was like gravity, an unseen force that pulled me in even when I fought to resist. Every glance across the room was a silent confession, every brush of his hand a whispered promise of what we could have again if we only gave in. And I wanted to give in, God, I wanted to give in so badly I could taste it. But Lisa was always there, blissfully unaware, filling the house with her laughter, her energy, her unshakable trust in me. Every time she hugged me, every time she called me her best friend, the guilt slithered through me like poison. Richard tried to act normal, but I saw the way his restraint cracked at the edges. He was unraveling just as much as I was, though he was better at hiding it. He spoke to me the same way he always had in front of Lisa, polite, familiar, the perfect father figure. But when no one was looking, when our eyes met across the room, the truth burned between us. It was in the tension in his shoulders, in the way his jaw clenched when I walked by, in the way he gripped his glass too tight, as if trying to ground himself in anything other than the weight of what we had done. Lisa had no idea, not at first. She went about her days as if nothing had changed, dragging me to the beach, making plans for the rest of the summer, talking about the cute bartender in town who had asked for her number. But I knew it couldn't last. I knew that secrets had a way of festering, of clawing their way to the surface no matter how deeply you tried to bury them. And I was right. It happened one evening when the house was quiet, when Lisa had gone upstairs to take a long bath and I had made the mistake of stepping outside for air. The sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and violet, and Richard was already there, leaning against the railing, a glass of bourbon in hand. My breath caught the moment I saw him, every muscle in my body tensing, screaming at me to turn around and go back inside. But I didn't. I couldn't. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable, his grip tightening around his glass. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, measured, but I could hear the strain beneath it. I swallowed hard, my feet carrying me closer before I could think better of it. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, but even I didn't believe the lie. His jaw ticked, his eyes darkening, his control slipping just enough for me to see the storm raging beneath the surface. "There's everything to talk about," he countered, stepping closer, his presence overwhelming. "This thing between us, it's not going away." A shiver ran through me, but not from fear, from something deeper, something just as dangerous. "It has to," I whispered, but my resolve was crumbling and he could see it. He reached out then, his fingers grazing my wrist, and I sucked in a sharp breath. "Tell me you don't want me," he said, his voice a quiet demand, a challenge I wasn't strong enough to meet. Silence stretched between us, thick, suffocating, until I finally tore my wrist from his grasp, turning away before I could do something stupid. "We can't do this," I said, but my voice was shaking. A sound behind us made my blood turn to ice, a sharp intake of breath, the unmistakable sound of someone stepping back in shock. My heart plummeted as I turned, dread curdling in my stomach. Lisa stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, her lips parted in silent horror. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, her voice a mix of confusion and something far worse, betrayal. My mouth went dry, panic seizing my lungs, but I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. I had prepared for many things, but not this. Never this. Richard's expression hardened, his body going rigid, but I saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Panic. He wasn't prepared for this either. Lisa's gaze darted between us, her brows furrowing, her breathing uneven. "Tell me I'm imagining things," she said, her voice breaking. "Tell me I didn't just see what I think I saw." My throat closed, my body frozen in place, but Richard recovered faster than I did. "Lisa, it's not what you think," he said smoothly, stepping toward her, his voice calm, controlled. But she recoiled like he had struck her. "Oh my God," she whispered, shaking her head, her eyes brimming with hurt. "Oh my God." And then, just like that, everything shattered. She turned on me next, her expression twisting with something I had never seen before. Lisa had always been bright, light-hearted, so full of life that it was impossible to imagine her angry, truly angry. But now that light was gone, replaced by something raw and jagged. "How could you?" she spat, her voice trembling, her hands balled into fists. "You are my best friend, my father." The word cracked like a whip, and I flinched. She cut herself off, exhaling a sharp, uneven breath. I wanted to explain, to tell her it hadn't been planned, that I hadn't meant for any of this to happen, that it had spiraled into something neither of us could control. But what excuse could I possibly give? What words could make this right? None. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her nails digging into her palms. "I trusted you," she whispered, her voice filled with so much hurt it made my stomach churn. "I trusted both of you." She let out a hollow laugh, but there was no humor in it. "And to think I thought you were different, that you weren't like all the other people who just take whatever they want, no matter who it hurts." Tears burned at the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had no right to cry, not when I had been the one to betray her. "Lisa, please," I started, but she shook her head, her face crumpling. "Don't," she choked out. "Just don't." She turned to Richard then, her expression shifting from devastation to disgust. "And you," she hissed, her voice laced with venom. "You're my father. You're supposed to be better than this." Richard's face was unreadable, but I saw the way his hands curled into fists at his sides, the way his shoulders stiffened. "Lisa," he started, his voice low, almost pleading. But she was already backing away, her hands shaking, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. "I can't do this right now," she whispered, turning on her heel and storming back inside, leaving nothing but silence in her wake. I exhaled a shaky breath, my entire body trembling. "This is over," I said, my voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Whatever this was, whatever it is, it has to be over." Richard didn't say anything. He just stared at the place where Lisa had been, his jaw clenched so tight I thought it might break. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I realized something. No matter how badly I had hurt Lisa, no matter how much damage had been done, no matter how much I told myself that this was over, deep down I knew the truth. It wasn't over, not even close. The silence that followed Lisa's departure was suffocating, stretching out between Richard and me like a chasm neither of us could cross. I stood there, my breathing shallow, my hands trembling, my heart still racing from the confrontation that had just detonated everything I had tried so desperately to keep hidden. Richard hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but I could feel the storm brewing inside him, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him just as heavily as it did on me. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the unbearable stillness, but no words came. What could I possibly say that would make any of this right? I turned away first, my body rigid, my legs unsteady as I forced myself to move. The house felt different now, colder, emptier, despite the lingering summer heat pressing against the windows. The sound of Lisa's retreating footsteps echoed in my ears, a constant reminder of the damage that had been done, of the trust I had shattered. I knew I had to go after her, had to try to fix this before it became irreparable, but my feet refused to carry me forward. A part of me already knew. I had lost her. Whatever Lisa and I had before, whatever bond we had built over years of friendship, was gone. Richard's voice, when it finally came, was quiet, but there was an edge to it, something raw and uncontained. "She was always going to find out," he said, more to himself than to me. His hands gripped the railing of the patio so tightly his knuckles turned white, his jaw locked as he exhaled a slow, uneven breath. "We were careful, but not careful enough." The words sent a cold chill through me because they weren't a regretful confession. They were a realization, a calculation. He wasn't mourning the betrayal or the pain we had caused Lisa. He was trying to figure out what came next. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing myself to look at him. "This has to stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the crashing waves beyond the house. "It should have stopped before it even started." The lie felt bitter on my tongue because even now, even with everything crumbling around me, my body still ached for him, still remembered the way he had touched me, the way he had made me feel like the only thing that mattered. But Lisa had mattered. Lisa still mattered. Richard turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment I thought he might agree. that he might nod and step away and let me go before we both drowned in the wreckage we had created. But instead, he did the exact opposite. He moved closer, slow and deliberate, his presence overwhelming, his heat sinking into my skin despite the space between us. "Is that what you really want?" he asked, his voice deep, unreadable. "For this to end?" My throat tightened, my heart slamming against my ribs so violently I thought it might crack. "It doesn't matter what I want," I whispered. "It's what has to happen." But even as I said it, my resolve wavered, because the truth was that I didn't want this to end. Even after everything, even after Lisa's devastated expression had burned itself into my mind, I still wanted him. And that terrified me more than anything. Richard studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then, without another word, he turned and walked away. I stood there, frozen, watching as he disappeared into the house, leaving me alone with my thoughts, my regrets, and the unbearable weight of my own self-destruction. I found Lisa in her room, sitting on the edge of the bed with her head in her hands, her shoulders tense, her breaths shallow. The sight of her like that, so small, so unlike the confident, carefree girl I had always known, made my chest tighten with something close to grief. I stepped inside hesitantly, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't look at me, didn't move. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, until finally she exhaled a slow, uneven breath and lifted her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression unreadable, but it was the way she looked at me. Like she didn't recognize me anymore. That hurt the most. "Why?" she asked, her voice hoarse, brittle. "Of all the people in the world, why him?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? How could I put into words the way Richard had made me feel, the way he had drawn me in, the way every moment with him had felt like an unstoppable force I was powerless to resist? I couldn't, so I told her the only truth I had left. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear, Lisa, I never wanted to hurt you." She let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You did hurt me," she snapped, her voice rising. "You betrayed me, my best friend, my father." Her breath hitched, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "Do you have any idea how disgusting this is? How wrong?" Shame burned through me, raw and unforgiving. "I know," I choked out, my eyes stinging. "I know it's wrong. I know I should have stopped it. I should have walked away before it ever started. But I didn't, and I can't take it back." My voice cracked, my hands trembling. "I would if I could." Lisa stared at me for a long moment, her expression shifting between anger, sadness, and something that looked an awful lot like disbelief. And then finally, she shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin, unforgiving line. "I don't think I can ever forgive you," she whispered, and the words felt like a punch to the gut. Tears welled in my eyes, but I forced myself to nod, even as my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. "I understand." She looked away then, her hands gripping the sheets beneath her, her entire body tense, like she was barely holding herself together. "I need you to leave." My breath caught, panic clawing at my throat. "Lisa, please." "I need you to leave," she repeated, her voice stronger this time, unwavering. "I can't stand to look at you right now." I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming at me to fix this, to do something, but I knew there was nothing left to fix. I had destroyed something sacred, something that could never be pieced back together. So I turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. I packed my bags in silence, my hands numb, my body moving on autopilot. Richard was nowhere to be seen, and for that I was grateful. I didn't trust myself around him, not now. not when everything was still raw and open and bleeding. I didn't want to hear him say that this wasn't over, that we would find a way to make it work, because it was over. It had to be. As I stepped outside, the warm night air wrapping around me, I glanced back at the house one last time. The place that had once felt like a second home now felt like the site of my greatest downfall. I had lost Lisa. I had lost everything. But the worst part? Even as I walked away, even as guilt and regret consumed me, I still wanted him. And I knew deep down that some things weren't meant to end. Some things burned too hot, too deep, to ever truly be extinguished, even if they destroyed everything in their path. The days after I left the beach house were a blur of regret, silence, and an emptiness I couldn't escape. Lisa had been my best friend since childhood, the one person who had known me better than anyone, and I had destroyed that bond beyond repair. Every time I thought of her face, the hurt in her eyes, the way her voice had cracked when she told me she could never forgive me, it felt like a knife twisting deeper. I had lost her. I had lost myself. And worst of all, I had lost him. Richard hadn't called. He hadn't reached out. There had been no desperate messages, no late-night confessions of longing, no attempts to convince me that what we had wasn't over. And maybe that was for the best. Maybe it meant he had finally realized that this we had been a mistake from the start. But that didn't stop me from missing him. It didn't stop the ache that settled in my chest every time I remembered the way he had touched me, the way he had looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. I tried to distract myself. I threw myself into work, into meaningless conversations with people who would never know the weight I carried. I ignored the phone calls from mutual friends asking what had happened between me and Lisa. I avoided social media, knowing the sight of her life moving on without me would only make the pain worse. But no matter how much I tried to escape it, the truth always found me in the quiet moments, when I was alone with nothing but my own thoughts. And then, one night, there was a knock on my door. It was late, past midnight, and I had just curled up on the couch with a blanket, trying to find solace in an old book I had read a dozen times before. The sound startled me, sending a jolt of unease through my body. No one ever came to my apartment this late. My friends knew better than to show up unannounced, and I hadn't been expecting anyone. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the door, my pulse quickening. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I stood slowly, my bare feet sinking into the soft rug as I moved toward the door, my breath uneven. I wasn't sure why, but something felt off. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached for the handle, hesitating just long enough to question whether I should open it at all. But then, before I could decide, a voice came through the door, low and unmistakable. "Please." My heart stopped. I knew that voice. Richard. I sucked in a sharp breath, my body going rigid. My mind screamed at me to walk away, to pretend I hadn't heard him, to not open that door. But my heart, my foolish, reckless heart, had already made the decision for me. With shaking fingers, I unlocked the door and pulled it open. He stood there in the dim light of the hallway, looking nothing like the composed, powerful man I had always known. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled like he had been wearing it for days, and his eyes, those dark, commanding eyes, were filled with something raw. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, he exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I had to see you." My throat tightened, my grip on the door trembling. "Richard." "I know," he said, cutting me off, his voice hoarse. "I know I shouldn't be here. I know I should have let you go. But I can't." I swallowed hard, my pulse roaring in my ears. "Lisa." "You won't speak to me," he admitted, his voice laced with exhaustion. She shut me out completely. I lost her. His eyes searched mine, his expression tormented. And I lost you. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, fighting against the emotions threatening to consume me. You knew this would happen, I whispered. We both knew. He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. Knowing doesn't make it any easier. He took a step closer, and I could feel his presence, the familiar heat of him wrapping around me like a force I couldn't escape. I miss you. I shivered, my hands curling into fists at my sides. Richard, we can't. I don't care, he interrupted, his voice rough. I don't care about what's right or wrong anymore. I don't care about what people will think. All I know is that I can't breathe without you. Tears burned at the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. This will destroy us, I whispered. He shook his head. You're the only thing keeping me together. My resolve cracked, splintered into something fragile and breakable. I should have pushed him away. I should have told him to leave, to never come back. But I didn't, because the truth was, I missed him just as much as he missed me. And in that moment, standing in the dim light of my doorway, with the world falling apart around us, I knew that nothing, not guilt, not consequences, not even Lisa's hatred, could erase what we had. I reached for him first. He caught me in his arms, his lips crashing against mine in a desperate, hungry kiss that sent a shiver through my entire body. There was nothing soft about it, nothing hesitant. It was raw, consuming, filled with all the things we couldn't say. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me flush against him, his body warm and solid and real. I moaned against his mouth, my fingers fisting in his hair, dragging him impossibly closer. He tasted like whiskey and regret, like longing and recklessness, like mine. We stumbled inside, the door slamming shut behind us. Clothes were torn away, fingers desperate, breaths ragged. Every touch was a confession, every kiss a promise. We weren't supposed to be here. We weren't supposed to want this. But we did, and we took it anyway. Hours later, tangled in my sheets, his body pressed against mine, the reality of what we had done settled like a heavy weight between us. I traced a slow line down his chest, my voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? He exhaled, his fingers tightening around mine. I don't know. But the truth was, we had already passed the point of no return, and deep down we both knew the real answer. There was no turning back. Not now, not ever. The morning after, the weight of everything settled over me like a suffocating fog. The sun streamed through the blinds, casting golden streaks across the sheets tangled around our bodies. Richard was still asleep beside me, his arm draped over my waist, his breath slow and steady against my bare shoulder. For a brief moment, I let myself pretend that this was normal, that there was no storm waiting for us outside this room, that there weren't broken pieces of my life scattered at my feet. But then reality clawed its way back in, sharp and unforgiving, reminding me that this wasn't a fairy tale. It was a disaster waiting to happen. I shifted beneath his arm, trying to untangle myself from him without waking him, but the second I moved, his grip tightened. A slow, sleepy exhale left his lips before he murmured, "Stay." His voice was rough with sleep, warm against my skin, and for a second I almost let myself melt back into him, let myself drown in the illusion that this could ever be something other than a mistake. But the rational part of me, the part that had been screaming ever since I first let him touch me, refused to be ignored. I slipped from the bed, gathering my discarded clothes from the floor as quietly as I could, my heart hammering with every step toward the door. I barely made it to the bathroom before my phone started vibrating against the counter. I snatched it up, my pulse quickening when I saw Lisa's name flashing across the screen. My stomach lurched, nausea twisting through me like a knife. I hesitated for a long second, my thumb hovering over the answer button, knowing that whatever she had to say would be laced with venom, with betrayal, with the kind of pain I had inflicted on her. I braced myself as I finally answered, pressing the phone to my ear. "Lisa." "Don't say my name." Her voice was cold, sharp as glass, and I flinched at the sheer force of it. "You don't get to say my name like we're still friends, like you didn't destroy everything." I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter for support. "I didn't mean—" "Don't," she snapped, cutting me off before I could even begin to explain. "I don't want to hear excuses. I don't want to hear apologies. I don't want anything from you. I just want you to know that I see you for exactly what you are now." Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "Lisa, please, are you with him right now?" she demanded, her voice shaking, but whether it was from anger or devastation, I couldn't tell. I hesitated. It was all the confirmation she needed. A bitter, broken laugh crackled through the phone. "Wow, you really don't even care, do you?" "It's not like that," I choked out, my voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did." The venom in her tone was enough to make my chest tighten painfully. "You did, and you didn't even stop. You didn't even try to stop." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but somehow even more lethal. "You're dead to me." And then the line went dead. The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering against the tile floor. A strangled breath left my lips, my entire body shaking as I gripped the counter, trying to ground myself. But there was no escaping the reality of what I had done. Lisa was gone. The girl who had been my best friend for years, the one person who had always been in my corner, who had laughed with me, cried with me, trusted me. She was gone, and it was my fault. A hand brushed against my back, startling me, and I turned to find Richard standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He had pulled on his pants, but his shirt was still unbuttoned, exposing the lines of his chest, the marks my fingernails had left against his skin. His gaze flickered to the phone on the floor before settling on my face. I nodded wordlessly, my throat too tight to speak. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "Don't be. I did this to myself." Richard stepped closer, his hands finding my waist, his touch grounding despite the storm raging inside me. "You're not alone in this," he murmured, his fingers tightening against my skin. "We'll figure it out." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this wasn't the end of everything, that somehow there was a way out of this that didn't leave us both in ruins. But deep down I knew the truth. There was no figuring it out. There was only the wreckage we had created and the reality we had to face. Over the next few days, everything unraveled faster than I could control. Lisa made sure everyone knew. Mutual friends started avoiding me, whispers followed me wherever I went, and my phone filled with messages that ranged from disappointment to outright hatred. I had become the villain of my own story, the cautionary tale people whispered about behind closed doors. Richard wasn't spared from the fallout either. His reputation took a hit, rumors swirled through his professional circles, and even though he tried to shield me from the worst of it, I could see the exhaustion wearing him down. We were trapped in a scandal of our own making, and there was no way out unscathed. One evening, I sat curled up on his couch, staring blankly at the glass of wine in my hands, my mind numb. Richard sat beside me, his fingers brushing against mine, but I barely felt it. "You haven't said much," he murmured, his voice careful. I exhaled slowly, staring at the deep red liquid in my glass. "What is there to say?" He hesitated, then reached for my hand, his grip firm, steady. "Do you regret it?" I should have said yes. I should have told him that I wished I had never let this happen, that I wished I had walked away when I still had the chance. But I didn't, because despite everything, the pain, the guilt, the destruction, I didn't regret it. I regretted hurting Lisa. I regretted losing her. But I didn't regret him. I looked up at him then, meeting his gaze, letting him see the truth in my eyes. No, I whispered. His expression softened, something unreadable flickering across his face before he leaned in, pressing a slow, lingering kiss against my forehead. Neither do I. And that was the most dangerous truth of all. Even with everything crumbling around us, even with the world turning against us, we still weren't willing to let go, no matter what it cost us, even if it destroyed us completely. The fallout of our affair was like a tidal wave, dragging us under before either of us could catch our breath. I had thought I understood consequences, that I had prepared myself for the worst of it, but nothing could have braced me for the reality of losing everything I had once held dear. Lisa was gone, erased from my life as if we had never existed in the same orbit. Mutual friends had chosen sides, hers, of course. I couldn't blame them. I had become the kind of person people whispered about, the cautionary tale, the one whose name would always carry the weight of betrayal. At first, Richard and I tried to pretend that we could withstand the storm. We told ourselves that what we had was worth it, that love, if that's what this was, could survive even this. But love wasn't enough to undo what had been done. It wasn't enough to bring back Lisa, to erase the disgust in people's eyes when they looked at me, to rewrite the story that had already been told. Love wasn't enough to change the fact that I had set fire to the only home I had ever known, and now I had to live with the ashes. The nights spent wrapped in Richard's arms weren't enough to make the guilt disappear. The whispered reassurances, the stolen kisses, the desperate promises that we'd figure it out, it all felt hollow in the face of what we had lost. He tried to be my anchor, but I could feel him slipping too, drowning just as much as I was. His career had taken a hit. The whispers had reached his colleagues, his social circle. He still had power, still had control, but the scandal had stained him in a way that even he couldn't shake. And me? I had nothing left to lose. It all came to a head one night when Richard came home later than usual. I had been staying at his place more often than not, hiding from the outside world, avoiding the judgment that awaited me beyond his walls. I had started to feel like a ghost, like a woman who existed only in the shadows of her own mistakes. When he walked in, his tie loosened, his face drawn with exhaustion, I knew something was wrong. I set my glass of wine down, watching him carefully. What happened? He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair before pouring himself a drink. They're pushing me out, he said finally, his voice tight. Not officially, not yet, but it's happening. My stomach dropped. Because of me? He shook his head, but the truth was already in his eyes. Because of us. I looked away, my throat tightening. I had known this was coming, but hearing it aloud made it real in a way I wasn't ready to face. What are we doing, Richard? I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. What do you mean? I forced myself to meet his gaze, to say the words that had been clawing at the back of my mind for weeks. Is this worth it? My voice broke on the last word, my fingers curling into my palms. We've lost everything. And for what? A relationship built on guilt and destruction? Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, frustration, maybe even desperation. Are you saying you regret it? I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him that I wished I had never let him touch me, that I wished I had walked away before any of this had begun. But I couldn't lie to him. Not about this. I don't know, I admitted, my voice trembling. I don't know anymore. His jaw clenched, his grip tightening around his glass. I love you. The words should have meant something. They should have been enough, but they weren't. Love didn't change the fact that I had destroyed my best friend. Love didn't erase the way people looked at me like I was something rotten. Love didn't undo the fact that we had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I love you too, I whispered. But sometimes love isn't enough. He exhaled sharply, setting his glass down with a quiet clink. So that's it? He asked, his voice rough. After everything, you're just going to walk away? I shook my head, my hands trembling. I don't know how to stay. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Richard ran a hand over his face, looking as exhausted as I felt. If you walk away now, there's no going back, he warned, his voice quieter now, laced with something raw. I swallowed hard, my heart aching in a way I hadn't expected. Maybe that's the point. He didn't try to stop me when I walked past him, when I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. He just stood there, watching, his expression unreadable, his body rigid. I wanted him to stop me. I wanted him to tell me that we could fix this, that somehow there was still a way out of the mess we had made. But he didn't. And maybe that was his way of letting me go. I stepped outside, the cool night air biting against my skin, my chest tightening with every step I took away from him. I had no idea where I was going. I had no plan, no future mapped out. All I knew was that I couldn't stay. The weight of what I had done would never leave me. Lisa would never forgive me. The world would never forget. And Richard would always be the one thing I wanted but could never have. Some mistakes you could fix. Others followed you forever. And I knew deep down that this was one of them. I stood outside Richard's house, the night air crisp against my skin, the weight of everything we had done pressing down on my chest like an unbearable burden. The door was still open behind me, the space I had just walked away from lingering like an invitation I could still accept. But I wouldn't. I couldn't. The past few months had been nothing but chaos, a whirlwind of desire and destruction, and now, standing on the other side of it, all I could feel was exhaustion. I turned back one last time, my eyes searching for him, for a reason to stay, for an excuse to undo this choice. But Richard just stood there, his hands at his sides, his expression unreadable. There was no plea on his lips, no desperate attempt to hold me back. He wasn't going to fight for me, not because he didn't want to, but because we both knew there was nothing left to fight for. "You'll be okay," he said quietly, his voice rough. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to nod even though I wasn't sure it was true. "You will too." But we both knew that was a lie. For a long moment, neither of us moved, neither of us spoke, and then finally I turned, stepping onto the pavement, my body carrying me forward even as every part of me begged to look back. I didn't, not this time. Some goodbyes needed to be final. Some doors needed to stay closed. I had lost my best friend. I had lost my place in the world I once knew, and now I was losing him too. But maybe this was the price I had to pay. Maybe this was the only way to make peace with the choices I had made. One day, I would move on. One day, the world would forget, but deep down, I knew the truth. I would never stop missing him.